the doomed invasion begins. Operation Barbarossa had already collapsed in principle long before a single German soldier stepped across the Soviet frontier. For with the limited options available to Germany's political and military leadership in 1941, and in the complete absence of a coherent, achievable strategic objective, a war against the Soviet Union was destined to fail from the moment it was conceived. It was the monstrous collision between two dominant ideologies of the age, fascism and communism, meeting head-on with every ounce of manpower, steel, fuel, and fury that each side could summon. It became a war of conquest, a war of criminal aggression, a war violating every standard of international law, and ultimately a war of annihilation driven by the racial fanaticism of National Socialism. People throughout the Soviet Union immediately understood that Hitler's regime had launched a war intended to eradicate them entirely. There could be no negotiation, no compromise, for compromise meant death. Right from the outset, the operation was saturated with criminal intention. What made Barbarossa uniquely horrifying was that morality, restraint, and law were deliberately discarded. The plan, if one could call it a plan, amounted only to the vague notion that Germany would strike the Soviet Union, seize Moscow, and assume victory would simply materialize. Such thinking was detached from reality to a staggering degree. German forces pushed forward with such reckless haste that they left signposts in place along the roads they abandoned, mute reminders of the arrogance and brutality with which they advanced and later retreated. On August 23, 1939, a German aircraft touched down in Moscow. Stalin sent his own armored limousine to retrieve Hitler's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop. What followed, the signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, shook the world. Imagine the surreal sight. The two greatest ideological enemies of the century, Bolshevism and National Socialism, suddenly embracing one another after years of venomous propaganda. This propaganda had been vicious on both sides, filled with accusations, slander, and hatred poured across Europe from Nazi channels and from the Comintern alike. Then, with one signature, the bitter enemies stood allied.
The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact declared that neither nation would support or assist the other's foes. Hidden in a secret protocol was the agreement to redraw the borders of Eastern Europe. The pact shocked governments worldwide, yet it was an extraordinarily shrewd tactical maneuver for both dictatorships. Each regime bought the one resource Hitler and Stalin valued most: time. Hitler gained time to wage his campaign in the West. Stalin gained time to rearm, rebuild, and reorganize his military. And both had agreed, implicitly and explicitly, to divide Eastern Europe between them. The pact cleared the way for Hitler's invasion of Poland. Even before German operations concluded, Soviet troops swept into eastern Poland. German Wehrmacht and Soviet Red Army units met at Brest-Litovsk, carving up a nation between them. Under the pact, Nazi Germany received vast quantities of Soviet food supplies and critical raw materials. By May 1940, the Wehrmacht felt powerful enough to strike at France and the Western Allies. Within mere weeks, France was crushed and forced to seek an armistice. Hitler emerged believing himself to be a master of modern warfare. The myth of the Blitzkrieg was born. Yet Hitler was far from an unintelligent man. He had risen from nothing and clawed his way into absolute power. Through bitter experience, he had studied crowds, deception, mass psychology, and manipulation. From this, he forged an ideology divorced from reality, yet he knew when to adjust it for tactical advantage. Up to 1940, this ruthless flexibility had delivered victory after victory. On July 6, 1940, Hitler returned triumphantly to Berlin. He had already decided that after defeating Britain, he would turn to his true obsession, the conquest of the Soviet Union. That same day, General Franz Halder wrote in his war diary that it was time to establish the political and military basis for the General Staff's future work. But by then, Hitler's decision was final. Lebensraum in the East, the expansion of German territory across Eastern Europe, had always been his ultimate goal. Under his orders, detailed planning began. Different branches of the armed forces explored their own scenarios. For years, even in the early 1930s, the German military had speculated about a war in the East. Now these ideas crystallized under the force of Hitler's command. On July 31, 1940, Hitler gathered his most senior officers and formally announced his intention to invade the Soviet Union in the following spring. By this stage, Hitler's authority was absolute. Even those who doubted him did not dare challenge him. Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, was tasked with shaping the operation. The detailed planning was placed in the hands of Major General Friedrich Paulus. Both Halder and Paulus became instruments in converting Hitler's ideological fantasies into military orders. The tragedy was that their professional focus blinded them to the catastrophic consequences of Hitler's worldview. Paulus was one of the leading staff officers developing the earliest concepts of the operation, still unnamed at that time. Meanwhile, the various arms of the German military, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the overall High Command, each drafted their own plans. These were compiled and presented to Hitler on December 5, 1940. 1 week earlier, Paulus had presented an initial war game scenario, a lightning-fast armored breakthrough intended to prevent Soviet forces from retreating into the enormous hinterland. Even then, Barbarossa was only one option among many. Germany's leadership remained focused on defeating Britain. Three concerns dominated strategic planning: the air war over Britain, the Atlantic naval campaign, and operations in the Mediterranean. Barbarossa existed in parallel, not yet the singular priority.
But by December 1940, Hitler accelerated preparations. The invasion became certain. He willingly stepped into the two-front nightmare he had once vowed to avoid. Directive number 21, Operation Barbarossa, laid out Hitler's true vision: the destruction of the Soviet state and the conquest of a massive expanse stretching from Arkhangelsk to Astrakhan. After the Red Army was crushed, all remaining Soviet forces were to be driven beyond the Ural Mountains. Their land would become German colonial territory. This ideological vision shaped the Wehrmacht strategy. Though reckless, the invasion seemed tempting. German commanders perceived the Soviet Union as poorly led, chaotic, and fragile, a giant with feet of clay. Many believed that after a few crushing blows, the Red Army would disintegrate. Halder wrote that the operation was meaningful only if the Russian state is destroyed in one swift strike. The plan depended on obliterating the Soviet armed forces near their western border before retreat was possible. Blitzkrieg was the method: overwhelming armored thrusts designed to encircle enormous Soviet formations. Yet Germany's generals knew, or should have known, that the Soviet Union possessed one of the largest armies on Earth. They underestimated it catastrophically. The Red Army's poor performance in the 1939-40 Winter War against Finland encouraged this arrogance. Despite the bravery of Soviet troops, they suffered enormous losses due to inadequate leadership, lack of winter gear, and insufficient automatic weapons. German generals used this as proof that the Soviets could not fight effectively. But they ignored the overwhelming size of the Soviet Union and the limitless potential of its mobilization. Even in 1941, German planners had no unified strategic goal. In the Soviet Union, the Hitler-Stalin relationship was believed to be permanent. Stalin considered their mutual blood pact unbreakable. Hitler thought otherwise. German planners supported Hitler's ambitions, blinded by their own arrogance toward Slavic peoples. In January 1941, Halder wrote that the objectives of Barbarossa remained unclear, yet preparations continued. The military's traditional obedience drove them on. By early June 1941, units across Germany prepared to move east. In Paderborn, a supply unit led by Lieutenant Gottfried Bugelmann, a young officer and amateur cinematographer, prepared to depart. His footage captured the eager mood of soldiers unaware of the nightmare ahead. He and his men were heading into a war of extermination whose full scale few could have imagined. Living space in the East had long existed as an idea in German political discourse, but under Hitler it became something far more extreme, the eradication of entire peoples. Throughout the 1930s, Hitler had repeated his plans so obsessively that by 1941, anyone who understood his words knew the war would be genocidal. Nazi propaganda films like The Soviet Paradise revealed their intentions openly, the extermination of tens of millions of Slavs. Barbarossa was conceived as a war of annihilation, engineered to depopulate Soviet lands and replace the Slavic population with Germans. In Nazi racial ideology, Soviet citizens were less than human, obstacles to be removed. Bugelmann's unit crossed Germany by train to East Prussia, where the invasion was set to begin on June 22, 1941. Their task was to maintain the supply lines for the fighting divisions. Propaganda prepared the troops with lies about Soviet plans for aggression. Goebbels himself delivered the declaration announcing the supposed Soviet conspiracy that justified the invasion. The Wehrmacht deployed 153 divisions. The Red Army had 237. Barbarossa could succeed only if the Soviets were encircled early before they could flee to the east. Blitzkrieg was essential. Fast armored thrusts, swift encirclements, decisive victories. Yet the Soviet Union was too vast to be conquered quickly. Nonetheless, German leaders still believed victory would come within 6 to 8 weeks. Nazi newsreels showed German forces crossing from East Prussia into Soviet territory with confidence. In truth, five massive German thrusts smashed across a 2,000-mile front from the Arctic north to the Black Sea in the south. Nearly 2 million Axis soldiers stepped into Soviet territory, convinced of swift triumph. But beneath this veneer of confidence, one fact remained. Germany had entered a war it could never win. Firestorm in the East. The German General Staff understood perfectly well that the war had to be short. Germany lacked the resources to sustain a prolonged conflict, even though Hitler believed that sheer German superiority would eventually crush the Soviets. Thus, operational planning remained completely fixated on a rapid victory, and the target at the center of that belief was Moscow. Whether capturing the Soviet capital would have truly changed the outcome remains uncertain, but the dispute between Hitler and his senior officers revolved entirely around this crucial point. In the early days of the invasion, the head of the General Staff, Franz Halder, wrote in his war diary, "The enemy appears tactically surprised everywhere." The assault became a massive collision of two very different armies, the modernized, battle-seasoned Wehrmacht and the Red Army, which, despite its size, lacked critical experience. The Wehrmacht had been fighting continuously for almost 2 years, sharpening its offensive power. Along the old Soviet border, the defensive lines of bunkers and fortifications held up the German advance for days, causing heavy German losses that Nazi propaganda carefully concealed. Despite their numerical strength, Red Army troops lacked experienced leaders. The purges of the late 1930s had wiped out nearly the entire command structure,
leaving the army with young officers who had hardly any frontline experience and often no idea what was unfolding. Soviet doctrine demanded that battles be fought outside Soviet territory, on foreign ground. The Soviets believed that by pushing everything forward to the border, they would keep the war out of their homeland. Instead, this created the exact circumstances the Wehrmacht needed. German armored wedges, supported by relentless Stuka dive bombers, punched deep into Soviet lines. Bugelmann captured his own version of the advance with his 16mm camera as the German units rolled deeper into Russia. As the only surviving son in his family, he had been kept out of direct frontline duty and was attached to a supply unit, yet even from the rear he witnessed the relentless movement east. His unit struggled to keep up with the pace of Army Group Center, which surged ahead through Belarus and into the heart of the Ukraine. Stops were brief, hurried, and immediately followed by deeper penetration into Soviet territory. The villages and towns they encountered were unprepared for the devastation that arrived with the Wehrmacht. German troops took whatever they needed, food, livestock, supplies, destroying any hope the civilians had of survival. Many Ukrainians initially saw the Germans as liberators from Stalin's terror, but they quickly learned the truth. The Wehrmacht beating looted everything, leaving the population destitute.
Bugelmann's unit played its own part in this. Tasked with supplying the 9th Armored Division, they helped fuel the machinery of destruction. Tanks and armored vehicles, which formed the spearheads, were critical for rapid encirclements, the centerpiece of German strategy. But the image of a fully mechanized, unstoppable German army was illusion. In 1941, the Wehrmacht still depended on horses as much as it did on trucks. There were roughly 600,000 motor vehicles, but also 600,000 horses, the true backbone of the army's mobility. By mid-July, Bugelmann's unit paused briefly near the town of Nizhin in the Chernihiv Oblast, a settlement with centuries of history. Only 3 weeks after the invasion began, it fell to German forces. The roads were brutal, dirt paths that turned to thick dust in the heat and mud in the rain. Trucks constantly sank, broke down, or overheated. Villagers, under German orders, often had to help push them free. These scenes foreshadowed the logistical disaster Germany would face within months. But in summer 1941, the Wehrmacht still pushed forward like a storm. According to Barbarossa's design, the armored thrusts were to advance toward Leningrad, Smolensk, and Kyiv. Meanwhile, vast Soviet armies would be encircled and annihilated. The early encirclement battles were enormously successful because they mirrored old German military doctrine: attack, outflank, surround, destroy. German tanks spearheaded deep advances, closing enormous pincer movements. Then the slower infantry and horse-drawn units arrived to complete the trap. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. An amateur cameraman moving with the 6th Panzer Regiment photographed the aftermath at Kyiv after the city fell. 3 factors explained the staggering number of Soviet prisoners in the early months. First, German shock tactics ruptured Soviet lines and sealed off gigantic pockets. Second, Soviet officers were inexperienced and overwhelmed. Many had no idea of the broader situation. Third, Soviet tactics forbade retreat. Soldiers were ordered to stand and fight, even when encirclement was certain. 8 years of Nazi propaganda had conditioned German soldiers to see their enemies not as fellow soldiers, but as racially inferior beings. Captured Red Army troops were mocked, beaten, starved, and denied basic humanity. Temporary holding grounds filled with starving men. Forced marches stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Countless prisoners died along the road. Survivors described trails lined with bodies. Men who collapsed were shot or left where they fell. Those who reached open-air camps found no shelter, food, or water. German soldiers hurled scraps of bread into crowds of thousands as entertainment, while the prisoners fought desperately for the crumbs. This was exactly what German leadership had intended.
The Wehrmacht made no supply provisions for Soviet POWs. Starvation was the plan. One of the most grotesque spectacles occurred when starving prisoners dug holes in the earth with their bare hands for shelter. German soldiers watched, laughing, believing they were witnessing proof of Soviet inferiority, when in reality they were witnessing the consequences of deliberate cruelty. In August 1941, Joseph Goebbels personally toured a POW camp near Riesa to inspect the subhumans his propaganda had demonized. Meanwhile, Hitler's high command issued the notorious Barbarossa decree on May 13, 1941, before the operation even began. It declared that crimes by German soldiers against Soviet civilians would not be prosecuted. It also allowed German officers to execute civilians based on suspicion alone. This decree, combined with the Commissar Order, which mandated the immediate execution of all Soviet political commissars, made Barbarossa a criminal war from the first moment.
Political commissars were easily identified by the special insignia on their sleeves. They were to be shot on sight. Their status as soldiers was stripped away. International law did not apply to them. The order created chaos and encouraged indiscriminate killing. Many German officers objected only because they feared it would provoke Soviet troops to fight harder. They worried, correctly, that commissars, knowing death awaited them, would resist to the last breath, refusing surrender. Yet few objected on moral grounds. Many felt communists and Jews deserved no mercy. After the Wehrmacht captured Liepāja in Latvia, mass executions began almost immediately. Red Army soldiers, communists, and nearly the entire Jewish population, around 7,000 people, were murdered. By chance, a man named Marine Richard Wiener filmed one of the massacres. On August 15th, Heinrich Himmler himself attended a mass execution near Minsk. Reportedly, he turned pale at the sight of the slaughter. But afterward, he declared that such actions, though difficult, were necessary. The Wehrmacht's advance created the space needed for the SS death squads, Einsatzgruppen, to carry out mass murder. Cooperation between the Army and SS was smooth and systematic. The Army provided transportation, supplies, manpower, blocking units, flamethrowers, and explosives. Troops stood guard while entire communities were wiped out. The myth of a clean Wehrmacht was born after the war, but it is a lie. The Army was deeply complicit. As the Wehrmacht advanced deeper into the Soviet Union, soldiers began to feel overwhelmed by the endless expanse. The Soviet Union seemed without limit. Despite massive casualties, the Red Army fought back ferociously. German losses soared. The blitzkrieg machine that had crushed Poland and France was now burning itself out on the vast plains of Russia. By mid-August 1941, German casualties reached over 200,000. The 6th Panzer Regiment suffered massive losses, but Nazi propaganda still trumpeted victory. German euphoria was blinding. After only 2 weeks of success, Franz Halder, supposedly the most rational of Germany's military planners, wrote that no war in history had ever been won so quickly. This delusion would soon cost Germany everything. When Hitler visited his troops in Ukraine that August, Halder was already realizing that capturing Moscow would not be easy. He wrote bitterly, "Destroy a dozen Soviet divisions and they simply form another dozen." The German leadership had no idea what the strategic goal even was. Hitler made constant ideological decisions. The generals argued for military logic, but neither side recognized the truth. The Soviet Union was too vast, too populous, too determined to be crushed quickly. Still, Hitler boasted privately that the war was essentially won. He declared that Moscow would be razed to the ground. But the reality was the opposite. The illusion of success was breaking. By August 1941, Operation Barbarossa was entering its first crisis. Despite massive Soviet losses, the Red Army refused to collapse. German progress slowed. Blitzkrieg was dying. The Germans had underestimated their enemy, underestimated the terrain, underestimated the climate, underestimated the logistics, underestimated everything. And ahead of them stood the greatest trial still to come, the assault on Moscow and the winter of 1941.
The siege and the shattering of the Blitzkrieg. Despite the Wehrmacht's sweeping victories during the summer of 1941, disaster was already gathering on the horizon. After months of relentless fighting, enormous losses, and constant strain, the Red Army remained unbroken. Moscow still lay roughly 600 kilometers away. The muddy Russian autumn, the dreaded Rasputitsa, was approaching. Back in Germany, Nazi propaganda continued to boast of easy victories, careful never to reveal the brutality or the catastrophic costs the soldiers were paying. Yet in the USSR, the entire country was mobilizing for survival. The fall of Kiev, one of the largest encirclement battles in history, dealt a devastating blow to Soviet forces, but it did not break their resolve. Nearly 700,000 Soviet troops were trapped around Kiev. The Luftwaffe reduced large parts of the city to rubble. Germany celebrated the victory with hysterical joy. The Wehrmacht officers gazed upon the burning capital of Ukraine as though assured of destiny. But in the shadows of the flames, the next crime was already being prepared. SS Einsatzgruppen, in cooperation with Wehrmacht units, planned to eradicate the Jewish population of Kiev and anyone else deemed an enemy. The massacre was officially justified as retaliation for alleged partisan attacks. Field Marshal von Reichenau welcomed radical measures, openly supporting a policy of terror. The result was Babin Yar, one of the largest single mass shootings of the Holocaust. Tens of thousands of Jews were rounded up, marched to a ravine, stripped, and executed over the course of only 2 days, September 29th, 30th, 1941. Wehrmacht units sealed off the area and aided the SS. Engineers helped cover the mass graves with explosives and bulldozers. No myths of military honor survived Babin Yar. The army was deeply complicit. In 1946, 15 Germans, including generals, were tried in Kiev. Most were executed. Their testimonies revealed the horrifying details of the massacre and the Wehrmacht's shameful role in it. Even as these crimes unfolded, German forces pressed onward. Odessa and the Crimean Peninsula were new objectives. Army Group South advanced, with Hans Bastian, the propaganda cameraman, capturing more scenes of triumphant war. Meanwhile, Bugelmann's supply unit reached Smolensk by early October. He still held unused film reels and continued documenting what he believed was an unstoppable march toward Moscow. But abroad, military observers were beginning to doubt German success. During the summer of 1941, the Germans had advanced so fast that British and American analysts feared the Soviet Union might collapse. But by autumn, they recognized that German momentum was slowing. Facing the possibility of a Soviet defeat, the United States extended further aid to Moscow. The Lend-Lease program delivered essential supplies: trucks, weapons, metals, food, and fuel. When the agreement was signed, a Soviet official reportedly shouted, "Now we will win the war!" On October 20th, the German Sixth Army captured Kharkiv after a fierce struggle. It opened the path to the vital Donbass region. Yet victory still seemed far away. The brutality of the German advance, the massacres, the starvation, the destruction, ignited fierce resistance among Soviet civilians.
Even those who despised Stalin turned against the invaders. Everywhere the Wehrmacht advanced, it left behind burned villages, dead civilians, and a thirst for revenge. Partisan warfare exploded. Civilians who had lost everything fled to the forests to fight back. Moscow itself prepared for siege. Over 300,000 volunteers built defensive lines around the capital. Trenches, anti-tank ditches, and barricades transformed the city. In the center, tank traps and barbed wire were placed on major streets. Behind the scenes, the government evacuated vital treasures: the embalmed body of Lenin, the gold reserves of the USSR, and priceless cultural artifacts, all secretly transported east. But before the German army could even attempt an assault, the weather arrived like an enemy army of its own.
The rains turned roads into seas of mud. Trucks became useless. Supply lines collapsed. Bugleman's unit suffered constantly. Vehicles bogged down, horses exhausted, men struggling to move even a few kilometers per day. This paralysis was experienced along the entire front. German leadership had catastrophically underestimated logistics. They believed the war would be decided before supply issues mattered. They assumed Soviet collapse would solve every problem. They planned no plan B. Footpaths dissolved into mud pits. Only fully tracked vehicles remained somewhat operable. Railroads had to be converted from Soviet broad gauge to German standard gauge, a delay that crippled the advance. German trucks broke down in the mud and dust. Spare parts were scarce. Captured Soviet vehicles required parts that didn't exist in German supply systems. By autumn, the Wehrmacht's armored spearheads, the pride of German military power, were already blunt, worn down, immobilized. Bugleman later boasted that his unit was always on time, but when he returned home to Paderborn in November 1941, his entire unit had been wiped out during the assault on Moscow. The Soviet capital prepared for the worst. 6 armies defended Moscow. Stalin understood that losing the city would be catastrophic symbolically, but not militarily. The Soviet Union had limitless manpower and vast industrial resources relocated beyond the Urals. German intelligence failed to grasp this reality. The Red Army had been shattered during the summer, but now it reformed again and again with fresh divisions. New tanks, artillery, and ammunition arrived every day. The Germans found themselves fighting not against a single army, but against a nation capable of continuously creating new armies. Napoleon had encountered the same phenomenon in 1812, an enemy that refused to surrender its homeland. As German soldiers neared Moscow, their strength was spent. Many divisions were reduced to fragments. Ammunition was limited, supplies scarce, and winter clothing non-existent. Hitler insisted the capital would fall. His generals, exhausted and increasingly anxious, questioned whether the war could still be won. Yet Hitler dismissed their concerns. He had absolute faith in willpower and absolute contempt for reality. By December 1941, winter arrived earlier and colder than almost any in living memory. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Tanks froze, guns jammed, engines cracked. Soldiers suffered frostbite so severe that limbs turned black in hours. In Berlin, the news of disaster arrived at the worst moment. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into the war. Hitler declared war on America days later, sealing Germany's fate. On December 13th, the Soviets announced that the Nazi advance on Moscow had collapsed. Their counteroffensive had broken through German lines along the entire front. Even if Moscow had fallen, Soviet resistance would have continued. The USSR had already formed 97 new divisions in the Far East alone. No defeat of a city, however symbolic,
could break a nation of such size and determination. The Red Army pushed the Germans back. In the north, Kalinin, captured by Germany on October 14th, was retaken on December 16th. Scattered German troops surrendered, emerging from rubble and trenches like ghosts. Soviet soldiers and civilians greeted each other with tears and relief. Children received their first food in weeks from liberating troops. Families embraced those who survived and wept for those who hadn't. But liberation came at a terrible price. Retreating German forces left behind scorched earth, burned villages, destroyed factories, mined roads and corpses. The Red Army advanced through only devastation. Still, Soviet resolve hardened. They would fight on no matter what the cost, just as their ancestors had during Napoleon's invasion. History repeated itself. Meanwhile, in the north, the siege of Leningrad was turning into one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. Cut off from the world, the city was slowly starving to death. German forces destroyed grain warehouses, bombarded supply depots, and targeted anything that could sustain life. Their goal was simple: let the city die. Food rations fell to starvation levels, 3 thin slices of bread for the vulnerable. As temperatures reached -38 degrees Celsius, homes froze from within. Families slept fully clothed, with hair freezing to blankets. People collapsed on the streets. Mass graves filled endlessly. Children and the elderly died in their beds. Thousands resorted to acts of desperation, including cannibalism, horrific proof of the famine engineered by the German siege. By the end of 1941, official death counts reached 54,000, a horrifying underestimation. In early 1942, the numbers exploded. In just 3 months, January, February, and March, more than 300,000 people perished. Not until the spring of 1942 did the first meaningful relief supplies reach Leningrad. But the siege would continue for a total of 872 days. The people of the city endured the unimaginable, while outside their walls, German forces sat and waited for their deaths. Barbarossa had begun as a promise of swift victory. Instead, it had become a catastrophe, a crime against humanity, and a military disaster that exposed the madness of Hitler's vision. And yet, the war was still young. The worst was yet to come. Stalingrad, the Caucasus, and the turning tide of the Eastern Front.
The Summer Gamble and the Road to Stalingrad. By June 13, 1942, the mood in Moscow had transformed. The fear and tension that once gripped the capital were gone. Film director Mikhail Slutsky was commissioned to document a single day in the Great Patriotic War, and his cameraman captured scenes of a city that had refused to fall. The Wehrmacht had been stopped outside Moscow. The first great German offensive had failed. Later, German generals would claim that from the moment the offensive stalled at Moscow, they knew the war could no longer be won. Yet they continued to serve the dictatorship that forced them into a conflict of annihilation. Hitler ordered that no further assault be made on Moscow. Instead, by spring 1942, Germany prepared a new offensive. The Wehrmacht had replenished its armies, restocked ammunition, and mobilized more divisions. Morale needed repair, and Hitler planned an ambitious new strike that he believed would smash the Soviet Union once and for all. Hans Bastian, the propagandist cameraman, returned to the Eastern Front equipped with 35mm color film. He filmed scenes of soldiers, tanks, and landscapes, all through the lens of loyalty to Hitler, portraying the German war as noble, vast, and victorious. His footage, though visually impressive, masked a growing reality. Germany was weakening, and the Red Army was growing stronger with each passing month. The Germans again enjoyed early success.
They still possessed a formidable offensive capacity, and their troops remained confident. But the Red Army had grown wiser. They adapted. They withdrew strategically. They no longer allowed themselves to be encircled in the vast pockets that had doomed them in 1941. Soviet patriotism surged. Stalin invoked the spirit of 1812, the resistance against Napoleon, urging the people to defend the motherland at any cost. And so they did, with a ferocity born of desperation and historical memory. Germany launched Operation Blue in the summer of 1942, targeting the oil fields of the Caucasus, vital lifelines the Reich desperately needed. Without Soviet oil, Hitler believed the Red Army would collapse. Without Caucasian oil, Germany itself would suffocate. Soviet defenders held Sevastopol in the Crimea with around 100,000 men. Stalin ordered them to fight to the last. The siege dragged on for months. Finally, in July 1942, Manstein's forces captured the city, but at immense cost. As the German offensive spread south, Hitler and Mussolini met to discuss the strategic direction of the war. The Italian dictator pledged full loyalty, but Germany's allied troops, Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian, were increasingly responsible for holding vast front sectors. These armies were inadequately trained and poorly supplied. They would later become the weak links that cracked under Soviet pressure. In May 1942, the Red Army attempted to retake Kharkiv with a massive offensive, but the Germans repelled the attack and encircled Soviet forces. Hans Bastian filmed the destruction, portraying German victory as inevitable. But behind this propaganda lay chaos. The German advance was reckless, tactically brilliant in moments, but strategically blind. They captured territory without securing the flanks. They pushed forward without stabilizing supply lines. They relied on Allied armies ill-equipped for defensive warfare.
Meanwhile, Soviet civilians suffered. Occupation brought terror, starvation, executions, and the destruction of entire villages. The brutality of German rule birthed a fierce partisan resistance. Women became essential to the movement, smuggling weapons, intelligence, food, and medicine from occupied towns to forest camps. Soviet propaganda romanticized partisans as heroic defenders of the motherland, but the reality was brutal. Ambushes, reprisals, torture, and endless death on both sides. Even so, the partisan war became a major problem for the Germans. They never managed to suppress it. Instead, the resistance grew, fueled by every atrocity the invaders committed. Meanwhile, Operation Blue stretched southward across the steppe. German tanks thundered across the plains, kicking up clouds of dust. Bastian's camera captured these sweeping movements, portraying Germany as invincible. But the vastness of the terrain worked against the Germans. The farther south they pushed, the thinner their lines became. Armored divisions raced toward the Caucasus, intending to seize the oil fields at Maikop and Grozny. Their flanks were now dangerously exposed. Stalin, recognizing the threat, issued Order Number 227 on July 28th, not one step back. Retreat without orders meant execution. Blocking detachments from the NKVD stood behind Soviet positions, ready to shoot deserters. Discipline was enforced with terror. But it worked. The Soviets held. Hitler then altered his strategy. Instead of focusing solely on the oil fields, he split Army Group South in two. Army Group A was to seize the Caucasus. Army Group B was to take Stalingrad. This was the fatal error. Splitting forces weakened the German offensive. One army became two, both under strength. The front stretched into an impossible elongated shape across thousands of kilometers. German generals warned Hitler that 300,000 men were not enough to take Stalingrad.
But Hitler ignored them. He believed that capturing the city bearing Stalin's name would break Soviet morale and secure the Volga River, the vital artery that carried Soviet supplies from the south and east. Stalingrad, at first, was not intended to be a major objective, but Hitler became obsessed with it. It turned from a strategic point into a symbolic prize, and then into a death trap. In September 1942, the first German units reached Stalingrad. Many Soviet troops panicked and fled, but Stalin's brutal discipline forced them back into the fight. The city was transformed into a fortress. Buildings were turned into bunkers, factories became strongholds, rubble fields became killing zones. The Germans entered a nightmare. Blitzkrieg, built on movement, mobility, and armored thrusts, was useless in a shattered city. Stalingrad became a house-by-house slaughter. Soldiers fought in basements, stairwells, ruins, and alleyways. Snipers hunted each other. Neither side controlled the city. Instead, they inhabited overlapping pockets of chaos. Despite Soviet resistance, by mid-November 1942, the Wehrmacht held nearly all of Stalingrad. A few Soviet footholds remained near the Volga, constantly reinforced by ferries darting across the river under fire. Then, in one of the most brilliant operations of the war, the Soviet command unleashed Operation Uranus, a massive encirclement maneuver. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets attacked the northern flank held by Romanian troops. They collapsed almost instantly. The next day, the southern flank, held by Italian and Romanian units, also crumbled. German lines buckled.
Within days, the Red Army pincers met at Kalach, completely encircling the German Sixth Army. 330,000 Axis soldiers were trapped in Stalingrad. A steel ring had slammed shut around them. Stalingrad, once a symbol of German triumph, became a prison. At this moment, a breakout was still possible. General Friedrich Paulus begged Hitler to allow a withdrawal, but Hitler refused. Sixth Army will stand fast, he ordered. Stalingrad will be held. Against all logic, Hitler declared that his trapped men would be supplied by air. Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring promised that enough supplies could be flown in. It was a lie. The airlift never came close to the required tonnage. Food ran out. Fuel vanished. Ammunition dwindled. Frostbite ravaged the troops. Disease spread through the ruins. Men froze to death in their foxholes. Horses were slaughtered for food. Some units dug in among the frozen corpses of comrades. Still, Hitler refused retreat. Still, Paulus obeyed. By late December, the Sixth Army was starving, freezing, and dying, but still fighting. Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal, expecting him to kill himself rather than surrender. No German field marshal has ever been captured, Hitler said. But Paulus refused to commit suicide. He surrendered instead, the first field marshal in German history to do so. The fall of Stalingrad on February 2, 1943, shattered the myth of German invincibility. 91,000 German soldiers marched into captivity. Only a few thousand would ever return home. Stalingrad was a disaster so immense that even Goebbels could not hide it. On German radio, he was forced to announce that the Sixth Army had died a heroic death. But the truth was simple. It had been abandoned by its leaders. Stalingrad became the turning point. For the Soviet Union, it brought hope and certainty. For Germany, it heralded the beginning of the end. The world now saw that the Red Army could destroy the Wehrmacht, and that Hitler's empire was beginning to crack. Collapse of Barbarossa and the rise of Soviet victory. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad, the propaganda machine in Germany struggled to mask the scale of the disaster. The Nazi regime had promised the German people swift victories, yet now an entire army had vanished in the ruins of a single city. Hitler's dream of conquering the Soviet Union, the very heart of Operation Barbarossa, lay shattered. The German plan to show the world the dominance of the so-called master race had instead revealed the true essence of National Socialism: destruction, criminality, delusion, and a genocidal hunger for power that would ultimately consume itself. The first major blow: Moscow and the rise of retreat. The failure to seize Moscow in late 1941 marked the beginning of the end. Despite all the Wehrmacht's strength, equipment, and training, the Red Army had held firm. Soviet divisions reformed again and again, throwing fresh waves of soldiers into the battle. German lines overstretched, their logistics collapsed, and winter destroyed what remained of Blitzkrieg. Even when the Germans attempted to advance again in 1942, the same problems persisted. Hitler had no coherent grand strategy. The Wehrmacht fought without a clear end goal, advancing wherever Hitler's obsession pointed. Every German victory bled the army dry. The rise of the Red Army and Soviet industrial might. While the German military weakened, the Soviet war machine grew stronger. Entire industries were relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, far from German bombers. Soviet factories produced tanks, aircraft, guns, and ammunition at astonishing rates. The T-34 tank, fast to manufacture and hard to destroy, poured onto the front lines in overwhelming numbers. Soviet manpower seemed inexhaustible. Entire new armies appeared to replace those destroyed in earlier months. In 1941 alone, 97 divisions were formed in the Far East. And with the help of American Lend-Lease supplies, the Soviet Union gained vital resources such as trucks, food, and metals. The longer the war lasted, the more the balance shifted. Germany's technological edge vanished, and the Red Army's learning curve soared. By 1942-43, Soviet commanders had improved their operational skills, mastering combined arms warfare and large-scale offensives. The Soviet counteroffensive of 1941 to 1942. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counterattack that pushed the Germans back from Moscow. This was the first major German defeat. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility cracked. German soldiers fled into the bitter cold as Soviet forces struck with renewed strength. The winter brought unimaginable suffering to German troops. Without proper winter gear or supply lines, thousands froze, starved, or died of disease. It was now clear the Soviet Union would not fall.
The Siege of Leningrad, a city buried in ice and death. While the Wehrmacht suffered before Moscow, the Siege of Leningrad reached unimaginable depths of horror. The Germans encircled the city, intending to starve it to death. They bombed food depots, shelled supply routes, and watched as civilians froze by the thousands. Inside Leningrad, citizens endured 600 days of famine, freezing temperatures, and constant bombardment. People collapsed dead in the streets. Families ate wallpaper paste, sawdust, or worse. The city endured 872 days of hell before the blockade finally lifted in 1944. Over 1 million civilians perished. Yet the city refused to surrender. Nazi plans to destroy its population failed. The story of German defeat begins at Moscow, but completes itself at Stalingrad.
Though the Soviet counterattack near Moscow was the first sign that Germany could be defeated, the loss of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad was the turning point that announced it to the world. German generals later claimed they knew long before Stalingrad that victory was impossible, but they lacked the courage to oppose Hitler. And so the Wehrmacht marched deeper into the Soviet Union, only to face inevitable destruction. The psychological collapse of the German home front. When Greater German radio finally announced the fall of Stalingrad, it attempted to portray the event as a heroic sacrifice. But the truth shattered German morale. Families in the Reich realized their sons would not come home. The myth of Hitler's genius as a commander evaporated. For the Soviets, however, Stalingrad ignited fresh determination. Soldiers believed now with certainty that the Red Army could drive the Germans all the way back to Berlin. The Red Army liberates Soviet lands. As Soviet forces pushed westward, they liberated towns and villages that had endured 2 years of German occupation. What they discovered defied comprehension. Burned homes, massacred civilians, mass graves, children starved, villages erased from the earth. German forces, retreating under Hitler's scorched earth orders, destroyed everything behind them. Crops, livestock, roads and railways. They turned entire regions into wastelands. Yet everywhere the Red Army advanced, people greeted them with tears, bread, and salt. Deliverance, they called it, though it came with immense sorrow. The Soviet spirit, unbroken, unyielding. The resilience of the Soviet people, their willingness to endure famine, cold, death, and terror, became the deciding factor in the war. Even those who despised Stalin stood shoulder to shoulder to defend their homeland. Soviet patriotism, reforged in fire, proved stronger than German ideology. Operation Barbarossa, a defeat that began on day one. Operation Barbarossa failed before it even began. Germany went to war without a clear strategic plan, without an understanding of the vastness of the Soviet Union, and without any realistic assessment of Soviet strength or resolve. Hitler imagined a swift victory, but his delusions blinded him. His army was not prepared for the climate, the distances, or the brutality of an enemy fighting for its survival. German generals followed orders they knew were suicidal, and in so doing, they marched their men into catastrophe. The war in the East became Hitler's grave, a grave for millions of German soldiers, a grave for Nazi ideology, and a grave for the Third Reich itself.